One day, a CEO decided to impersonate a customer and visit his own car dealership without anyone knowing. He drove an old Ford Ranger, a time-worn vehicle with faded paint and a taped driver's seat. He got out of the car, dressed casually in jeans, a canvas jacket, and old work boots, and no one paid any attention to him, which was exactly what he wanted. He was a simple man who had just finished work on the construction site. No one knew that just hours earlier, he had signed paychecks for the dealership's employees. The dealership, located on the outskirts of Amarillo, Texas, was not very big or flashy, just a simple Chevrolet GMC store. But after 5 years of ownership, he had completely rebuilt and transformed the place. However, rumors began to circulate, especially complaints about the treatment of customers from the Black and Latino community. These complaints were all coming in through one-on-one calls. But his concern was growing. Was this a misunderstanding, or was there a deeper systemic problem that he needed to address directly? And so, he decided to walk into his dealership, without anyone recognizing him as the owner. It was at this moment that he would have his answer. After receiving complaints from customers, especially Black and Latino customers, about being treated disrespectfully, the CEO couldn't ignore it. Although these complaints could be just misunderstandings, he felt something was wrong. These reflections were all gentle. No one raised their voice, but they were repeated enough to get his attention. However, he still wanted to believe that these were just individual incidents. But his inner voice told him that there was something deeper. So he decided to take action. He couldn't just stand by and listen to the complaints. He needed to know exactly what was going on. The CEO decided to conduct an undercover inspection of his dealership. He wanted to see for himself, not through reports or second-hand conversations, but through the eyes of a real customer. He wanted to see how the staff would treat him if they didn't know he was the one who started and ran this company. That's why he showed up at the dealership today, looking so casual that no one would recognize him as the one who founded and paid all these employees. And as he walked into the showroom, he began to get the feeling that this might not be a simple misunderstanding, but a bigger problem than he thought. When the CEO walked into the showroom, he immediately sensed a difference in the way the staff treated him. There was no warm welcome, no questions about his needs. A salesman in his 30s, with thinning hair and a notepad under his arm, looked at him coldly and said an unfriendly question, "Need any help?" There was no smile, no greeting, just indifference. "Yeah, I'm looking for a car," the CEO replied, trying to maintain his composure. The salesman just glanced over and pointed at the row of old cars gathering dust in the sun. Not stepping closer or starting a conversation. There was no approach or enthusiasm, and only a shrug when the customer asked more about the car's condition. At that moment, the CEO began to wonder if this treatment had anything to do with his casual appearance. If he had worn a polo shirt and carried a lease, would things have been different? Would the cars and sales opportunities have been presented to him with the respect they deserved? The CEO couldn't help but think back to the complaints he had received earlier. Things began to make sense. What he was witnessing was not an individual incident, but a systemic problem. It wasn't just a few unenthusiastic employees. It was the lack of respect that existed in the way this dealership treated its customers. After noticing the obvious disrespect from the staff, the CEO continued to observe and felt something more disturbing. He saw a white couple, about 30 years old, stepping out of a shiny black SUV. Immediately, another employee, younger, with a bright smile and a polished style of dress, quickly approached them. "Welcome, how can I help you?" The greeting and attitude were so enthusiastic that he could not help but pay attention. The employee not only provided water, but also made sure everything in the showroom was running smoothly and comfortably. The light from the digital screen in the showroom made the atmosphere comfortable and cheerful. But what caught the CEO's attention was the different treatment. While the couple was warmly welcomed, he, who was standing nearby, only received a glance and an impolite gesture from the first salesperson. This made him think deeply about the discrimination in his dealership, not just a lack of professionalism in customer service, but a clear discrimination based on appearance and underlying biases. The CEO couldn't ignore the feeling of discomfort that was rising inside him. He couldn't let this continue. Couldn't let this unfairness become part of the company culture. Everything from the attitude of the employees to the way customers were treated reflected the nature of the business. He began to realize that this was not just a small issue. but a serious problem that needed to be addressed immediately. As the CEO turned back to the car he was interested in, he felt a quiet frustration creeping in. The salesman, after a long wait, returned with the keys and a rough copy of the service booklet. His demeanor was no different than that of a bored salesman working overtime. "Here's the service booklet and the keys," he said, his tone unenthusiastic. "No thanks, no congratulations, just a gesture that he was just going through the motions." As the CEO looked at the service booklet, he noticed that there was very little useful information. Oil changes, battery changes, and a couple of tire changes. The dates in the service booklet didn't even match the car's odometer. This made the CEO feel not only disrespected but also slighted. He could clearly sense that the salesman had no interest in providing the best possible service to the customer. Little details like service history and vehicle information should have been provided in a transparent manner. But instead he was given a pile of incomplete, impersonal paperwork. At this point, the CEO couldn't help but wonder, if I had worn a polo shirt and had a contract in hand, would they treat me differently? This question rang in his mind like a blow to his conscience. It wasn't just the car. It was the way he was treated. The way everyone in the dealership looked at him. All of which showed a clear discrimination between customers based on their appearance. And it wasn't an accident. It was part of the system. A cultural issue that he couldn't ignore. As the CEO got back into the Sierra after the test drive, he felt a sense of unease rising inside him. The engine started dry, the seats creaked, and the air conditioning did little to ease the sweltering summer heat. Although the car looked fine, the discomfort made him reconsider. This wasn't just a test drive, but an experience that made him realize all the things that were wrong with his dealership. He couldn't ignore the sense of disrespect that permeated the air. When he walked into the showroom again, no one paid attention to him. The receptionist didn't look up. The manager was engrossed in his computer screen. He felt as if he didn't exist in this space, even though he was the one who had founded and maintained this business for so many years. No one stood up to say hello. No one offered a helping hand. The feeling was unbearable. This was not how a business truly cared for its customers. The other customers who came with him were warmly welcomed, while he was ignored. This made him even more certain that this was not just an individual incident but a systemic problem. This was a system that did not respect customers, especially those who did not look standard as they expected. He knew that this disrespect was not only hurting the customers, but also hurting his own agency. And he decided, no matter how painful it was, to face this truth. It was time for a change. It was time to make it clear that fairness and respect for customers had to be core elements of the company's culture. As the CEO stood there, an uneasy feeling rose in his heart. He couldn't ignore the scene before him. A young black man, in his 20s, was standing quietly near the door, holding a file. He looked around, his eyes filled with hope. But no one paid any attention to him. No one came forward to ask if he needed help. This scene not only made the CEO's heart ache, but also reminded him of the times he had been in a similar position. Feeling abandoned, treated unfairly just because of his skin color or appearance. Not long after, the young man finally left. Alone, silently, as if he didn't exist in this dealership. The CEO just stood there, feeling increasingly frustrated. It wasn't just a lack of professionalism in customer service. It was a blatant lack of fairness. Discrimination, no matter how small, could make a person feel like he didn't deserve help, didn't deserve to be heard. It became even clearer to the CEO that this was not the first time he had seen this. This was a long-standing problem within his agency, and he could not let it continue. Customers, especially those from minority groups, could no longer tolerate this discrimination, and if this was not addressed, everything he had built would collapse. He could not accept a work environment that lacked fairness and respect. When the CEO returned to continue the transaction, the atmosphere in the showroom became even heavier. He walked straight to the reception desk, full of frustration and determination. "I just test drove the Silver Sierra. I want to continue working on this car," he said to the receptionist. The receptionist looked up, tapped on the keyboard, and replied coldly, "Which Sierra?" "Silver, right." Not a word of thanks. Not a trace of enthusiasm or concern. The CEO began to feel the distance growing more and more obvious. The receptionist just tapped on the keyboard, not looking at him with the respect he should have shown a customer. This time, The lack of attention from the staff was not the only thing that annoyed him. As soon as he sat down on a nearby chair, his eyes stopped on an image that could not help but make him think. A young black man, about 20 years old, stood at the entrance with a worried expression, holding a piece of paper in his hand, waiting, but no one in the dealership seemed to notice him. The CEO stared at the scene, a choking feeling rising in his chest. He stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away, seemingly having lost all hope for this place. This was not an individual incident. This was a systemic problem, a major problem that could not be ignored. The CEO realized that if he did not act now, everything he had built would collapse. And that was when his decision came. He could no longer ignore it, could no longer let discrimination continue to exist in this dealership, where people came to seek fairness and respect. When the CEO entered the office, the atmosphere in the showroom was strangely quiet. He stood at the door for a moment, observing the employees who were absorbed in their work, but none of them seemed to notice his presence. They continued with their daily tasks, but the silence in the air made him feel that something was very wrong. There was no greeting, no friendly glance directed at him. He felt like a ghost, someone who did not exist in this space, and this only made him more determined. Unable to bear it any longer, the CEO decided to walk up to the reception desk, where the employee was busy typing. "I just test drove the silver Sierra and want to continue working on that car," he said, trying to stay calm. The employee did not look up, only said coldly, "Which Sierra? 110,000 miles. No smile, no enthusiasm, just cold indifference. The CEO realized that this was not a small problem but a sign of a system that was not working properly. But what made him feel even more frustrated was what he witnessed during the next conversation. When he looked over, he saw a young black man standing near the door, holding a file in his hand, looking around with hope in his eyes. But no one in the showroom paid any attention to him. The young man stood there for a moment and then finally turned and walked out. Just like that, without a word of encouragement or approach from the staff, the CEO watched the scene, feeling as if a part of his mind had been torn away. This was not only unprofessional, but deeply disrespectful, and at that moment, the CEO realized that everything he had built at this dealership was being threatened by the culture of this place. It wasn't just a few employees who lacked communication skills. It was a systemic problem, a cultural problem that he couldn't ignore any longer. He decided that he would not just stand by and watch, but take action, change everything to protect the values he believed in. Things had to change, and change now. When the CEO entered the room, he could clearly feel the change in the atmosphere. The room was silent, all eyes were on him. The atmosphere was completely different from when he first entered. He didn't say anything, just stood there and observed the employees. It was a moment of silence, but it was so heavy that it was hard to breathe. The people who used to work beside him now didn't dare to look him in the eye. They knew that everything had changed. This feeling was not the first time he had experienced it. But this time, it was really different. He had seen discrimination, had witnessed the lack of respect for all customers. And this was not just limited to the employees who had come into contact with him. But it was a problem for the entire dealership. A systemic problem that he could not ignore. He had spent his life building this business. But now, he realized that he could not let it become a place where people were judged just because of the color of their skin or their appearance. He turned back to the silent employees. "What do you think your job is?" he asked. Not too loud but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Your job is not to sell cars. Your job is to serve customers. All customers, no matter who. Cars are just products. What we're selling is trust. How to treat people." He looked at each face in the room, then back at the receptionist, who still didn't dare look at him. "What you need to learn is respect," he continued, not taking his eyes off her. "Because without respect, you'll never build trust." A moment later, the CEO reached up and signed the contract.